name is Kevin Owens, and I have the honor and pleasure of introducing Dr. Kevin Morley. He's a manager with Federal Relations for the American Waterworks Association, the AWWA. He works closely with multiple organizations to advance the security and preparedness of the water sector. This includes supporting the development of several ANSI AWWA standards that represent the minimum best practice for water sector risk and resilience management, including cybersecurity guidance. He is a leading expert on Section 2013 of the America's Water Infrastructure Act of 2018, AWIA, and multiple resources that enable water systems to advance their security and preparedness to all hazards. Dr. Morley is also a member of the President's National Infrastructure Advisory Council. He received his PhD from George Mason University for research on water sector resilience and developing the Utility Resilience Index. He holds a Master of Science from the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and a Bachelor's of Arts from Syracuse University. And Kevin's going to talk about the water sector today in managing risk, and this is very important looking in light of the recent news of last week with Florida. So take it away, Kevin.
Sure. Thanks, Kevin, and appreciate the opportunity to join you all this morning. I know some folks are experiencing some challenges down in the Southwest, so my heart goes out to y'all. But as you know, as Kevin just said, I went to school up in Syracuse, so this was kind of just normal operations up there. But I recognize that folks aren't prepared for that down that way. So stay safe and do your best to keep yourself warm. In that regard, Kevin did note, obviously a fairly significant event that captured quite a bit of news here in the last week, and I suspect will continue to remain in the news for a bit, especially on the heels of the SolarWinds incident, and that's what happened to the utility down in Oldsmar, Florida. So just kind of to set the level straight, I'm not really going to look at kind of armchair quarterbacking. That's the specifics in Oldsmar. I think some of the advisors have come out sort of to speak to themselves, but really kind of prior to Oldsmar, what we have been doing and what some of the critical provisions are in advancing cybersecurity in the water sector, amongst other things, and importantly within the context of AWIA, or I'll try to do my best not to go into DC abbreviation speak, but America's Water Infrastructure Act of 2018 and the provisions that requires upon utilities, but also just a broader contextual kind of issues of just general roles and responsibilities and fiduciary obligations of water utilities, which really applies across a number of different infrastructure systems. So let's go ahead and get going here if I can roll these slides. So again, start off with the statutory drivers. I don't think I probably need to spend too much time on the reality of the threat environment. Recent events certainly kind of make that crystal clear, but really part of where I really want to go with the conversation here is really talking about cybersecurity and risk management in the water sector, based on the conversations that I've had with Kevin and Teresa and the interest of the audience here. So want to make sure that that's clear, what we're doing and the resources available, and certainly things to share. So I'm not going to read all of this. You're all perfectly capable of that, but I always find it interesting to start off and share with folks, a conversation that the American Waterworks Association's board actually had in 1941, as the clouds of war were brewing for World War II between the water sector and a gentleman by the name of J. Edgar Hoover. And as a result of that, Mr. Hoover actually wrote and published we ended up publishing it in the November edition of Journal AWWA, a story about the importance of security, if you will, to water systems and what water utilities could do. And of course, back then we weren't calling them terrorists, but they were saboteurs and foreign agents and things of that nature. But recognize right from the right back then that water is critical to the nation's economy, and that still holds true today. It is out of sight, out of mind, and a lot of people take water for granted until you have a big freeze down in Texas or something, and water pipes start bursting, and suddenly people get a quick appreciation. So I always find it's interesting that story came out, literally weeks before uh, the infamous event of Pearl Harbor. Um, and so that's been the point there, is that this issue and these concerns have been on the front of mind for utility owners and operators for quite some time, and certainly as a critical infrastructure systems, dependent on the communities, dependent on upon them for 24/7 operation, 365. That is the mission of the water utility, in addition to public health. And so that is there, and certainly there's a number of other events that have occurred since Pearl Harbor, of course, that have influenced the dialogue and the direction of the nation's security kind of policies. But most recently, the two most recent things that I'm going to dial into here today are provisions or actions taken under Executive Order 13636, which led to the NIST cybersecurity framework, amongst other things. And in October of 2018, provisions that amended the Bioterrorism Act of 2002, which is what Kevin was noting as Section 2013 of America's Water Infrastructure Act. So just to put that into context, and I'll spend a little bit of time on this, but AWIA Section 2013 really requires two critical things. One is the development and preparation of a risk and resilience assessment that covers a number of different things. Just kind of quick background, Bioterrorism Act 2002, for folks that may not be aware, was very focused on the terrorism threat nexus, right? And so as a result of that, as utilities went through that evaluation, the findings were extremely biased towards physical security controls, because that was the narrow scope of the threat profile. With AWIA, and in the context of since 2002, we've dealt with things like Hurricane Katrina, the wildfires in the West, a number of different flooding incidents, and a number of natural disasters. So one of the key differences in AWIA is the inclusion of natural hazards as part of the overall threat paradigm, which really allows us to kind of balance and right size the options and solutions where the utility can maximize risk buy down or resilience enhancement. So that's what's in the risk and resilience assessment. And then within 6 months, they have to certify an emergency response plan as well. So the first round is done. So that's for community water systems that serve greater than 100,000. So say like a Dallas or Oklahoma City or Chicago or something like that. They had to submit that risk and resilience assessment last March. And then by September of last year, they had to certify to EPA that they completed an emergency response plan. Now, the important thing here is that by doing so, the utility is basically taking account for itself that they have done their due diligence to address the threats and matters that were articulated in the statute, and take ownership of that risk. And as a result of that, we know that a number of utilities are taking a number of different actions to address the findings from those assessments. I will note that for anybody that is a wholesale system, the population of all the communities that you serve dictate your compliance deadline. And this is a continuous 5-year cycle. So in 2025, this cycle will repeat again, unlike the Bioterrorism Act, which was a one and done kind of operation. So again, I'm not going to read all this, but this is the first provision on risk and resilience assessments, and what I've highlighted there are the provisions that are really targeted towards what I frame as the cybersecurity provisions. And so, just kind of for context, what's bold and underlined is what is new and different from the Bioterrorism Act of 2002. So you can see quite a fair bit of the information and the statutory requirements are consistent with what was in 2002. And so I think it's important to probably unpack a little bit of what's not written into the rule, but what the meaning of those monitoring practices and financial infrastructure are. So monitoring practices of the system really means not just the water quality, sampling and analysis the utility does on a day-to-day basis, but it also includes the electronic and other systems that may manage access control, obviously the cybersecurity system. A number of utilities, lots of utilities have energy management systems and other things that create connectivity in the utility and therefore create potential exposure risk to outside threats or even internal threats. And then financial infrastructure is recognized, and I should say that monitoring practice of the system acknowledges the potential threat and risk to uh, OT systems. So our process control systems that run the pumps and motors and things of that nature. The financial infrastructure is not, the credit rating with Moody's or Fitch or something like that. It's really recognizing the interest in ransomware type attacks and really focused on the financial or enterprise systems where frankly the money is, and that personal information that we see get taken from so many different organizations, including our own office of personnel management, amongst others, or Equifax. That's the stuff that gets sold, uh, PI kind of information. So make sure the utilities are taking appropriate account of that. So then jumping ahead to the second phase on the emergency response plan, which is really a poorly labeled section because a number of these things wouldn't actually be in your traditional ERP. I really call this the preparedness provision. So really what we're doing here is asking utility to take the information you had in that resilience assessment and take some action on it, right? Identify the strategies and resources that you would put in place to improve the resiliency of the system, including cybersecurity. So there's a clear intent here to uh, uh, direct the utility towards action against the vulnerabilities identified. And sometimes that's eliminating an item. Sometimes that's risk transfer through insurance, or it's implementing best practices on things like cybersecurity, which we'll talk to. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this particular piece. The statute kind of speaks for itself. And again, the stuff bold and underlined is new and different from what was in the Bioterrorism Act. So cybersecurity threat, I think this audience is probably pretty conversant in that. But, in the water sector, how the conversation has evolved, and this may be true in other sectors, but I'm the water guy, so that's my kind of point of view. Y2K was probably the first really kind of big picture, all systems, kind of taking into consideration, wringing their hands over what was going to happen at midnight in 1999 on New Year's, and whether or not there's things were going to work or not. So there was a lot of work of, how do we keep things going, and in that assessment, and the good thing is that it Y2K was what didn't happen. There's no big kind of catastrophic failure of computer systems. The bad thing is there was no failure systems, and so I think it had a little bit of a cry wolf effect on a number of different folks. My own personal opinion, um, and there was all this hype, and then it didn't happen. So it really kind of got set aside from a leadership perspective as well. Okay, these cyber folks thought the world was falling, and then it didn't happen, and everything's good. And so, you know, maybe there's a little bit of psychological damage there in terms of our continuity and leveraging some best practices, 20 years ago. The water sector post 9/11 was the first sector to be regulated to do vulnerability assessments. And so, and as you noted in the provisions I shared before, part of that was to include, risk to computers and things of that nature. Now, granted, back in 2002, we didn't we had SCADA, we had process control systems, but we certainly didn't have, everybody didn't have one of these, and your refrigerator wasn't telling you that you were out of milk yet. So, you know, uh, there wasn't as much connectivity then and things like Stuxnet hadn't really happened. So the appreciation for some of the cybersecurity threats wasn't quite as high as it may have been. However, we did have a group of utilities with great foresight and recognize the potential risks and concerns. And so in 2008, 2007, AWWA worked with the Department of Homeland Security to develop this roadmap to secure control systems for the water sector. And really what this document is really a gap assessment. What are the challenges to the water sector moving forward? And one of the big things there is I'm sure you're all well aware, we're not the market maker. Water utilities don't change stuff very frequently. And as a majority municipally owned systems, right, we don't have massive budgets to do a lot of fancy stuff, and so that in and of itself is a challenge. But one of the things that was recognized there is like, hey, we need to create some kind of framework for water utilities to operate under, right? Because there's all these competing kind of guidances and directions, but we need to create a pathway for utilities to move forward. So come forward to 2013, I'm going to AWWA, recognizing the need from 2008, and also some direction from what's called the Water Sector Coordinating Council, where it said, "Hey, we need an approach to move the ball down the field." So under a program that I started in 2013 was to develop some guidance and direction. And I'll get into what that turned into, but we initiated a project in 2013 to create that foundation. And it just so happened that I actually issued the RFP for that project the same day that EO 13636 was issued. So it actually worked out quite well in working, allowing us to work very closely with EPA, NIST, and DHS to ensure that the end product, which we'll get to here in a moment, actually is complementary to the objectives of 13636 and provided that framework that we were desiring for our utility members. So again, coming back to this, the connectivity equals exposure, and certainly, again, I think this audience is pretty well aware of that. But as system architectures evolve, right? When those SCADA systems were put in place, and some of those business rules were put in place to kind of bring that's operational data into the business environment in the 80s and 90s, things like WannaCry and solar winds and things of those things were kind of far out there. So those systems were set up in an environment that was, let's just say, uh, not security conscious because the threat wasn't as prevalent or recognized as a possibility. I recognize that there were folks at that time that did recognize that possibility, but generally speaking, as a business rules perspective, it wasn't seen as a reality, right? We didn't have the internet the way it is now and everywhere and everywhere. But all these different business systems and process control systems are in many utilities and other utility infrastructures as well. And all those little, dots and connection points may or may not always be well appreciated, right? Mr. Owens may have put something in, 10 years ago, and I came in and put something in 5 years ago, and part of the fundamental here is understanding what that virtual or cyber infrastructure actually is, not unlike what you have in your pipe network or your collection system on the wastewater side. So I always kind of start off with understanding your architecture and your infrastructure is step one. And I'm probably preaching to the choir here on this, but you know, not knowing that makes managing this very, very difficult. So just kind of again a reality check on water sectors for catching all the news right now, but mind you, here's a just a snapshot of an assessment that the GAO did of federal agency systems, right? And I would say this is probably not inconsistent with other business enterprises of any sorts, right? So a lot of this, the common denominator in those three big pies of phishing, other, and improper usage are people. And it's a capacity and education and awareness thing, right? If people are the policies don't violate themselves. It requires a person to violate the policy. Or if the policy is not in place, it potentially becomes compromised. People click on emails, right? So there's a lot of work to be done just on kind of normalizing people's general awareness of the threat and that they are part of the solution, and that the importance of maintaining these policies and keeping them in place. And so I always find that the interesting is to see what the federal family is doing versus the private sector or the non-federal systems. And um, a lot to be learned there in terms of just kind of the human nature part of this equation. So again, this requires an active risk management strategy. There's been any number of advisories and information from our federal partners on the reality of this, and basically validating that there is intent to compromise systems anywhere from, whether it's Russian actors or other third-party actors that are trying to constantly penetrate our systems on a 24/7 basis. And it's a matter of, does the utility or the entity have the capacity to detect that? Do they have that technology? And usually, as we know, sometimes that takes many, many years, right? Or months, like as is the case with solar winds, right? It began probably about a year ago, maybe before that. I think it was really March. And then we didn't really realize the full extent of that because it was a fairly sophisticated attack uh, until just a couple months ago. And who knows, I think we'll continue to learn a fair bit about that over time. So, in a nutshell, what we've been advocating for in the water sector is that risk and resilience really requires an all hazards approach, right? So, back in the day, we were really focused on that kind of 9/11, Al Qaeda's around every corner kind of thing. And yes, that's a very important threat to be cognizant of, but that's not, thankfully, not the reality. But in the interim, we have all these other things that are pressuring utilities, whether it's floods or wildfires or tornadoes or hurricanes that have a higher frequency of impacting, or ice storms in Oklahoma, right? That utilities need to have a risk and resilience framework to act upon. And that's part of the provisions in AWIA that are trying to just institutionalize that. And not to be excluded is the reality of the cybersecurity threat, which is the number one threat that faces critical infrastructure in the United States from a national security perspective, based on our friends in the intelligence agencies. So, what are we doing about this? How are we trying to advance this? Well, one thing and one challenge that we had is, nobody ever has enough resources. And so the water sector is not immune from that. Some of our estimates from several years ago estimated that just the basic infrastructure needs of the water sector are then the tune of 1.2 trillion dollars over 25 years, just to maintain the physical infrastructure. And this is on the drinking water side alone, of pipes and uh, replacement of pipes that in some cases have been in place for over 100 years. That doesn't mean that they're bad, but that's it does create certain vulnerabilities and challenges. And so there is that kind of budgetary in limited budgets. There is that constraint, right? Our primary mission is public health, and so part of this conversation in the report we did in 2018, actually we released this right before AWIA was finalized with Judy Germano up at NYU's Center for Cybersecurity, was to really kind of articulate, hey, look, even we wrote this initially before AWIA was passed, even in the absence of an explicit federal requirement to take some action here, you as a utility have some explicit risk management responsibilities. And there's a number of different principles that are included here. And really what we were trying to communicate in this guidance document is that you as an entity, whether you're on the, the CEO or the board, you have some fiduciary responsibilities. And if the enterprise and process control systems that we've been talking about, or the focus of this conversation, are critical to your operations, your ability to do what you do, then you need to manage them as you do any other asset. You have a fiduciary responsibility to manage that asset in a reasonable way based on best practices. And we know that we have best practices. We've developed them, right? We have the NIST cybersecurity framework, we have the ISA standards and other standards that really kind of lay down the foundation of what is the best way to do this. The other principle here, from a legal construct, is the principle of foreseeability. And by this, to say that you couldn't imagine that a cyber bad actor, if you will, I don't like that word, but somebody with malicious intent would attack you through your computer systems, whether it's attacking your enterprise system through some kind of ransomware or targeting your process control system, is unforeseeable. It's just not a legitimate claim anymore. I mean, it's happened. It's happened in Oldsmar. It's happened in other communities. The Atlantas, the Baltimores, amongst others. So that is not a reasonable defense. In fact, that was the reason that the New York Port Authority was held more responsible for the 93 uh, World Trade Center bombing attempt than the actual bad actors, because they had done a vulnerability assessment that said, hey, you have exposure to vehicle bombs, and then they didn't really do anything about it. So that factors into this equation. So that means what you need to do as an entity is, how do you demonstrate due diligence, right? How do you prove that you did something? Now, the challenge in the cyber environment is that we're never going to build a fence high enough. We're never going to have, enough controls to thwart every possible cyber incident. But there's a lot that you can do to just basic blocking and tackling, and even more sophisticated things that do a lot to kind of lower the risk profile of the entity. And so again, there's legal kind of parameters here. Coming back to best practices, there's been some cases where an entity went to make an insurance claim to get recovery on a cyber incident, and through that evaluation, they came back to the entity and say, hey, well, what did you do to try to mitigate this risk or the threats? And it turned out that they hadn't made any effort to implement any cybersecurity controls, and therefore their claim was voided, and the insurance company didn't pay. And so, part of what we're trying to establish with some of the resources that I'll get into next is, how does the utility demonstrate due diligence, right? So you put in the fence, you put in the barriers, you put in the firewalls and things of that nature. That doesn't mean that the bad guy is not going to get through those things, but you've made a reasonable effort to manage the risk to your system and the associated consequences. So that's actions the utility can take. There is the option of doing some risk, what would be considered risk transfer through insurance, and that's kind of still a little bit of a wild west. And I don't know that some of those entities have a full appreciation of the OT side of this. They're a little more conversant in, kind of data privacy issues and what usually is the focus of ransomware incidents. But that is certainly a dimension. And again, that requires some demonstration of due diligence, which I think supports some of the objectives that we have here. Uh, and one other claim, and I won't spend a lot of time as a majority municipals, there is a principle of sovereign immunity. Our point in this particular guidance is that's probably not a reasonable defense in the realm of cybersecurity. So that's all I'm going to say about that. But this is a really good resource, and I think kind of is an important kind of level setting of expectations on roles and responsibilities for utility leadership. Excuse me. So coming into best practices, some of you may be aware that AWWA is an ANSI Standards Development Organization, or SDO. And over time, we've actually developed a number of different standards, uh, uh, the G430 standard, the J100 standard, and the G440 standard, all of which have some provision in there that set some expectation or consideration of cybersecurity risk management. So we've said this, the G430 standard, I think, was first issued in 2005-ish timeframe. So these have been around for a while, and these represent, as Kevin said, minimum what we would describe as minimum best practices for water utilities. Granted, they are voluntary, but again, when it comes to demonstrating due diligence, if you as an entity are able to demonstrate that you are following the principles in these standards, it doesn't mean that somebody, a bad actor, again, is not going to be successful, but you've taken a reasoned accounting of the situation and have taken some actions to, again, manage the risk. The last one is really on cybersecurity, water sector cybersecurity risk management guidance that we've developed, and this is really squarely right on a voluntary approach to implement the NIST cybersecurity framework. And when we updated it a year or so ago, we did ensure that it addresses and supports taking action on the cyber revisions in AWIA 2013. So let's go ahead and talk about that a little bit. So this is the guidance document. Again, this goes back to, the point that I made in the 2008 roadmap that we needed some kind of consistent, repeatable approach. That was the objective in writing this guidance document. And as a result, as we initiated, as I said, NIST was moving forward with the NIST cybersecurity framework. So we basically grabbed on to that and piggybacked that. And the big difference here, the big difference between our guidance document and the actual NIST framework, which, yeah, you could say, here, go implement NIST cybersecurity framework. That's a daunting task. Where do you begin? There's 100+ controls or whatever. Which one's most important to me? What we've done in this guidance and the associated tool is to say, okay, we don't expect everybody to go read NIST 853, but we can ask them what they do with technology. And so basically, what we have here is a series of questions that are framed around how does the utility apply technology? And then what we've done in the background, we've mapped that to the controls in the NIST framework, whether they're NIST standards or ISA standards or what have you, and then have done some prioritization on what is most important. So it makes it much easier for a utility to access this information and ideally begin to take some action. This guidance has been recognized by EPA, Department of Homeland Security. Certainly NIST is very happy about it. In a number of different states, there are several states that do have mandatory requirements at the state level for utilities to do cyber assessments, and this is one of the resources that they point to as being satisfactory of that requirement. So again, it's broken down. We broke it down into about 14 core practice areas. Governance and risk management, access control is certainly always important. We did include some of the new information coming out of Idaho National Labs about cyber informed engineering. So that's a kind of a new paradigm that's maybe not so new, but It's really, how do we lower the consequence of certain activities? And I think that'll be a new and growing area of activity as it comes to cybersecurity risk management that we're very encouraged by, and look forward to working with Idaho National Labs on that activity. So this is just an example of one of the questions, the first question. So, these are all binary. You either do it or you don't. And I suppose there's some instances where it's kind of like in between, and because maybe I do it this facility and that facility. And what I would encourage the user of this to do is to focus on applying the tool at a facility kind of perspective, on the off chance that there are kind of architectural differences in their kind of cyber domain, if you will. So based on that, there's a series of questions that get tripped in the background in terms of the controls that are applicable. These are all the different control paradigms that are kind of in the background as a reference. If you really want to dig into the actual standard associated with the control. But as I said, there's a priority scheme. So priority one, basically, don't care how big, little, or small you are. If this isn't in place, this is imperative. Got to have it. And then priorities 2, 3, and 4, kind of a escalating level of maturity, if you will, or you really wouldn't do priority 3 without doing some things in priority 4, kind of like putting your socks on before your shoes, kind of thing. So that's kind of the underlying logic associated with the prioritization scheme that's in there. And again, the objective here was to create a process to make it as simple as possible for utilities to move the ball down the field on cybersecurity. So at the end of the day, the output goes into an Excel file, and then that's where the utility really does the hard work of determining that the controls that they identified as being applicable to their operations either have or have not been implemented. And those are kind of tallied up on a summary page like this, where you really kind of get a percentage distribution of where utilities are taking action, and where there might be some needs. And so this helps from a decision making perspective when you go up to leadership and say, hey, look, we've got, you know, 15 priority one controls that have not implemented. And hey, boss, this is what it's going to take action on that, and lower our risk profile. So we think that's a really important resource, and have found that utilities that we've spoken with have appreciated this construct, and certainly would encourage you to use this with your utility clients, or if you're a utility yourself, to apply this. This is all based and fits into a larger paradigm of AWWA's risk and resilience resource suite. Uh, the kind of the foundation at, or a number of different standards that we feel are well designed to help a utility uh, comply with the AWIA provisions. In and of themselves, they don't make you compliant with AWIA, but they facilitate that compliance, and they provide an important basis for demonstrating due diligence. I would note, for those that you're familiar with the Safety Act, that the G430 standard and the J100 standard have been recognized under that by the Department of Homeland Security, meaning they are effective in their view in helping prevent or mitigate threats of terrorism. And I think we are going to be working in the coming year to get additional resources, including our cybersecurity guidance and use case tool, designated as well under the Safety Act, which provides some limited liability protection for the users of those resources. So the water sector, some of you may be aware, is a very diverse community. There's about 52,000 community water systems that range from serving 25 people all the way up to millions of people in a place like Dallas or Chicago or New York. But the majority of those systems serve less than 5,000 people. And so we've worked with a number of different partners to develop resources to support those small systems in their work on AWIA and just good practice, and as well as the USDA and those resources are available for free to those small systems through those grant programs. And so if you are one of those systems or you're working with one of those systems, I think these resources are very well suited. And in terms of cybersecurity, I still would use the tool, but we kind of come back around to about 27 kind of core foundational controls that are most critical if you have any kind of computing system in that utility. And then it would be a build up from there instead of kind of a top-down approach. So Kevin, that kind of wraps up a big picture review for me on what's happening in the water sector and some of the important resources. Certainly there are great resources also available from our friends at Department of Homeland Security. The Water ISAC has a top 15 list that's also useful, very complementary to the SANS top 20 or the some of the items in CISA. But if you're interested in more information, all those cybersecurity resources that I talked about are freely available. The only thing that is a little bit of a potential barrier for you, if you will, is the actual self-assessment tool does require you to create a customer account on the AWWA site for terms of use purposes, but does not require membership in AWWA to access. So again, we're trying to move the ball down the field, and we think this is a great kind of foundational step for folks to do that. So with that, Kevin, I take any questions. I don't know if stuff came in through the chat while I was kind of rambling on there, but happy to kind of riff on anything that came to your mind, or if the audience has questions to respond to that as well.
Well, we got a couple of questions, and we still have time for more, but some of them were focused on where can I go for more resources. So your links right there answer those questions. A couple other questions I got. Let's see. Are rural water treatment systems in Oklahoma, but you could relate that to anywhere across the country, vulnerable to attacks similar to Florida?
I would say that any utility infrastructure, independent of where they are vulnerable to the attack in Florida. I think we're going to learn a little more about the Florida incident, but that comes back to some of that really kind of foundational blocking and tackling, Kevin, and the business practices that a utility applies to manage the system. And yeah, sure, some of those things may be inconvenient, like nobody wants to see we call our IT guy the dream crusher, right? But changing your password frequently and having independent passwords and multi-factor authentication and things like that are kind of just some. I think people need to accept that that's a necessary thing and integrate it into the day-to-day business practice. And they're not that complicated to implement. It does take a little bit of work, but there's good reason for it. And hopefully, maybe the silver lining that comes out of something like Oldsmar is that, hey, this is an unnecessary risk exposure that is reasonably manageable with certain controls. They just need to be executed. I don't know if that answers your question, Kevin, but yeah, there's nothing special, no offense, to the utilities in Oklahoma that makes them less or more vulnerable. On the internet, right, we're all ones and zeros. And so as I was describing to somebody else, I'm like, if the barn door is open, the wolf's coming in, or at least has the opportunity to come in, right?
Yep. And this question came in before your thing about the resources, but I don't know if you could maybe talk about this more. What can water utilities do if they don't have a lot of resources to address this problem? I know you talked about the small water utilities, but
yeah, I mean, whether you come into my resource suite or somebody else's, I think the critical step here is, Kevin, is to accept that the risk, or rather the threat, is quite real, right? And you're either being targeted and know it, or you don't know it. And so you really encourage utilities to avail themselves of these resources, whether they're from AWWA or federal partners, and just, look at these controls. A lot of these basic governance controls, implementing a password protocol that requires everybody to have it, you know, isn't like some million, you don't have to go out and buy a Ferrari here, right? This is Yugo stuff. I don't know that maybe that's a dated reference, Kev. But I mean, there's some basic stuff that can be done, and that's what we've tried to do with this resource in helping utility kind of get their arms around the animal and see where they can take some effective action to just put up that at least that first line of defense and push the bad actor off to the next guy.
Yep. Make it more difficult so they go attack
Right.
the next place down the road.
Sure.
Let's see. Are these AWWA standards and guidelines, since you were talking about this, good practice for other sectors besides the water sector?
So the methodology, so the core methodology there, the J100 standard on risk and resilience, I think is easily transferable to other sectors. In fact, the foundation, I mean, it's your basic risk methodology, and excuse me, sorry. The difference is that we've kind of right sized it or contextualized it to how things would what would be important to the water sector. Obviously, not everybody has a source water intake, right? But I am actually having conversations with a couple other sectors on how do we transfer this principle to their working environment. So yeah, and our emergency preparedness standard. And part of the reason we wrote that for those that may be more familiar with something like NFPA 1600 is that was a perfectly fine standard. It was so generic, if you will, that it was hard to kind of put it into water speak. And so we had some very specific things that we do in the water sector that we wanted to ensure were captured and again contextualized to the water and wastewater environment. And so that's really the big difference. But the G430 standard kind of gets a little bit, I call that the umbrella standard because it gets into a number of different things. But there's some basic things there like access control. Okay, well, having access control at a water utility isn't any different than the need to have access control at a port or a refinery or something else. It may be different in the actual implementation, but the fundamentals of that layered defense is not something that's unique to water, if you will.
Yep. All right, and I have one more. I guess it's the zinger question. Will we have more attacks like this in the future? I'm guessing they're talking about Florida, or less.
Oh, I think that question answers itself. I mean, the bad guys. I mean, there will be more. Maybe not like Florida, but as we, and I don't want to sound like a Luddite here, Kevin, but I mean, as we connect more stuff, and 5G gets thrown out the door, and there's great efficiencies that come with that, but at the same time, it needs to be implemented in a mindful way that we don't create the opportunity for bigger and badder consequences because of that desire for efficiency. And there are challenges with workforce and things of that nature that things like 5G do help, but at the same time it also creates other vulnerabilities that I think don't always get discussed because it's not convenient to the business model of the providers of that technology. But yeah, I don't think that this is not going to go away.
Yeah, and I get I've been asked several times by news organizations in the past week, why don't we hear more of these in the news? And so my answer is because most people don't want to talk about these things, And secondly, no one wants to be worried about their water source. So I don't know if you can.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, this utility happened to be, within a stone's throw of the Super Bowl with a bunch of
Yes.
three-letter agencies hanging around. So, they did get unprecedented support and attention. And I'm not saying that a small community wouldn't get that support somewhere, but I have seen that when incidents of this nature have happened at smaller utilities elsewhere, I know for a fact it hasn't gotten this level of coverage. But
Right.
that's not to say that it shouldn't, but it doesn't.
Right. Yeah. So don't
But
worry about your water.
the guidance that has come out, I think, is helpful, and I think again, that maybe the silver lining of this incident does elevate the awareness, especially of those smaller utilities that may see some reflection of themselves in Oldsmar, and you know it's hopefully the lesson is actually learned and corrective actions are taken, or those types of controls are implemented.
Yeah, and as you said, a return to some of those security fundamentals that
Hmm.
everyone should be following.
Yep.
That's,
Yeah. So we're definitely examining ways to help support and facilitate that, Kevin, through well, we'll see what the policy game looks like, but I think there are some of this is purely a capacity and training education function, and certainly that's you know uh, we're looking to help support that, and would welcome any thoughts other folks have on reasonable policy solutions to get at the underlying challenges that are facing water utilities.
and I just got one more question. We are specifically talking about cyber/network penetration concerns. Are you aware of any physical penetrations at any facilities in the US or Europe? And
I mean, I guess I'll say yes, but that's about all I'm going to say on this kind of meeting.
uh, well, yes, and I know there are a series of physical incidents that have been in the news. Again, not all of them make it to the news, and some of them make a little tiny story in the
Yeah,
news.
I guess the one that I will throw out there, because it is out there, and it is the one incident that was actually prosecuted by the Justice Department, is the Bowman Dam in New York, where
Yeah,
Iranian nationals actually got into I mean, they were in the system and they had control, and the only mitigating factor was the fact that that uh, dam had been manually disabled, if you will, for maintenance purposes. But
yeah,
if that hadn't happened, they would have had control. Now, granted, I mean, there's other stuff, but the point is, it has happened, and
yeah.
that's the most public event that I would feel comfortable putting out there.
Yeah, that was um, but I've been there, so I know it's kind of like a little sluice gate
Yeah,
of
it's
the
not.
creek. So it's
It's
not a
probably a case of mistaken understanding of the asset they were got into, but nevertheless, that doesn't change the the gravity of the issue and the capability and intent to do that, right?
right. And malicious actors on the other side of the world or right here in this country have no idea if they're connecting into a major metropolitan city or a little community of 500 people. They have
Sure.
no idea what
Again,
they're
we're
getting
a
into.
bunch of ones and zeros, and those out folks are out there just kind of knocking on the doors, and it might be a water utility or it might be Home Depot. So again, this comes back to just understanding your system architecture, Kevin, and making sure that your assets aren't exposed. And you can go do that on Shodan real easily, and it's a little troubling sometimes what you see just hanging out there on the public internet.
Yeah. And there was some interesting cases in Boston a couple years ago where where a number of graduate students were caught and detained for They said they were trying to research the water system, and
Mhm.
they were caught after midnight at the Boston water facility. And after that, legal charges were placed against them, and those individuals never showed up for that court case.
Mhm.
And a week later, someone broke a lock at another facility for Boston City and got in there, but they had no evidence other than someone had broken in what that person did.
Mhm.
So, but there are a number of small cases like that. Plenty of things out there to research, or you can ask me offline.
That's right.
All right. Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Morley, this morning. We appreciate it, and sure everybody loved hearing about what they can do. And stay safe out there, everybody.